be good if we could think of a shit joke each.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
that's relatable. Like.
Tell me just how shitty this is. Right. I'm aiming for super shitty. Right. Good morning, good people, and welcome to the second Philosophy Podcast.
It's shit.
Firstly, we would like to thank all the people who have given us feedback. We've taken your points into account. We hope that you carry on giving us your support and look forward to working with you in the future.
Nah, fuck that. I reckon we should just completely disregard what everyone has said and just do our own shit.
You can say that if you want, and then I'll give you some. I'll heckle you for it.
How about this opening? Good morning, good people. Welcome to the second Philosophy Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about what our points are. Probably.
Nah.
Why don't we just record this conversation now?
3, 2, 1, and we're live. So, take it away, Will.
Shit, you really fucked me there. Is this actually going good?
Yes, man.
That's a good idea. Good morning, good people, and welcome to our second Philosophy Podcast. We appreciate your criticism, blah, blah, blah. You just listened to all the conversation before we started recording. Hopefully I'm going to edit this out on YouTube, because I'm a dictator.
Brilliant. So, we've had a little think about some topics we wanted to talk about today. Not entirely sure how we're going to start.
I feel like we're not very prepared for this one.
No, I know, but
I didn't even know we'd started recording.
Neither did I.
Well, we spent about 20 minutes deciding how we were going to start, so I figured we may as well just start and then see where that gets us.
All right. Yeah.
So we've had a little think about how we're going to format it since last time. We're going to try and be a little bit more. We're going to try and justify our opinions more. I think that was one of the problems last time.
And argue instead of just nodding our heads and smiling.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, nodding isn't really a good translated well into audio format, so we should probably avoid that.
That's an interesting question. How ethical was the show Noddy?
Noddy?
Noddy.
I didn't realise it was unethical.
No,
You're going to put forward an
I'm taking the
argument?
piss. That's pseudo-philosophy right there, mate.
Pseudo-philosophy.
I would like to pass on that. However, Jordan Peterson does a really interesting lecture series on Pinocchio.
Pinocchio?
So, I mean, that might be good.
Well, that's an actual old story with a lot of philosophy and morality behind it anyway. All the old Disney shit's like that.
Of course, in the future, maybe we'll be on webcam, and then people can see us nodding.
Do a live cast.
Hey, we can just sit there for 5 minutes.
It's the Nodcast. So, what do we want to attack first, boys? We got a nice little short list of some things we were thinking of talking about.
We can talk about the value of animals and human beings and the rights we should have.
Okay, yeah, let's start there. So, animal rights. Obviously very contemporary. There's a very, very big movement in the left now that's pushing forward for full animal rights.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, what do we think about that? Do we think they have the same moral rights as human beings, perhaps, as some people would argue? Do you think that they don't have any rights at all and they're just sort of a resource for us to capitalise on? Will, with the first opinion.
I definitely think that animals should have rights.
Okay.
But I think their rights should be based off legality. You know, legally, what rights should they have, rather than morality? Because I don't see how we should be able to judge what kind of morals they should adhere to, and what kind of morals we should apply to them, other than not being cruel.
I don't think an animal has to adhere to morals for it to be consideration of moral value. Surely the argument is just, are they consideration of a moral value? Which they are, in my opinion, because they exhibit like feelings and they feel pain and they seem to have emotional responses to things. So it seems like they're worthy of moral consideration. How much moral consideration they're worthy for, I think, is arguable.
So, what we're discussing is not so much whether or not an animal is adhering to some sort of moral code, but more so in what way should they be considered in our own morality and what are they deserving of. So I think the first thing we should probably talk about is what qualities an animal, including humans, need to become valid for moral consideration. So, I mean, if you're looking at bacteria, for example, we don't consider them morally at all. However, an ant, slightly more so. Larger animals until it gets to about the human point. So what traits is it that an entity needs to have to, for example, not deserve to be killed, or to suffer, or to be allowed freedoms of any kind?
I think sentience is definitely a big one. Sentience, self-awareness, as well as the ability to feel emotions, they should have the ability to know what they are. Perhaps what they look like might be a good example of the level of sentience they actually have. I think without sentience, or without a suitable level of sentience according to the moral code and the morality that we give them, I think that's pretty important. Otherwise, I can't imagine a way you can actually justify the morality behind it. For instance, some people, like you said, we're talking about the left and their views on animal rights. Some people genuinely view a puppy's life more valuable than, let's say, a politician's or a judge's. And I can't imagine any reasons for that except this sort of emotional bias.
They like puppies.
Exactly. They just like puppies.
Who doesn't like puppies?
Where's the actual justification? You can't have morality based off, oh, well, I feel like it, because other people are going to disagree with that, and you have no justification, no reasoning behind it.
So you think that to qualify for some kind of moral consideration, the creature needs to have a level of self-awareness, sentience? Yeah. Does it need to have a will to continue living? It desires to continue living?
I think most mammals have a desire to carry on living anyway.
Yeah.
But that's more an instinct rather than thought.
Yeah, I think that's arguably natural.
Yeah, I think if they have coherent thought, if they have the ability to make decisions, and if in somehow they could interact with our social contract in society, then we should be able to consider them morally.
I think it's important if they are interacting with each other as well.
Yes.
So, and it seems, and they, like, for example, supposedly when like cows, so when like a cow gets its calf ripped away from it, supposedly they seem to appear sad, or they seem to be crying, or any sort of cooperation, even as far down as like, I mean, ants seem to cooperate quite well together, don't they? Bees seem to cooperate quite well together. I think that's another level of sentience that is definitely of some value.
So you're saying that we should consider them if they can live in their own society, rather than if they can interact with our society.
I just think that being able to communicate with each other, or like in like the case of wolves, being able to work in a pack, or have some sort of emotional response to each other, like the loss of a pack member or the loss of another one of their group, I think that shows that they have a level of sentience that gives them more value. And then that
So you touched on quite an interesting idea there, in that some people would probably argue that to be considered in the moral sphere, you also need to be able to contribute to it. So to be considered morally is almost a social contract, as an act of reciprocation. So the reason it's quite hard to dispute that certain types of humans are not to be morally considered and others are, is because we're all capable of holding the same moral ground. We're able to reciprocate moral rights and the way we treat each other. But do you think that affects the way we should consider animals, in that, yes, we can treat them morally, but they are in no way looking at us with a sense of moral responsibility? Do you think that factors into it?
I'm not really sure. I think it's quite difficult to say. For instance, I mean, an easy example is a dog. You know, a domesticated dog, they have feelings towards the family. They will try to protect the family. So you can easily argue there is some sort of contribution to a society at that point, you know. But whether or not they're being used as tools rather than a member of the society is difficult to say. But we can also talk about farm animals. You know, farm animals technically are contributing to the society that they're involved in, but they aren't doing it of their free will. They aren't doing it knowingly.
Yeah.
And their own sort of emotional attachments, to the farmer or the other cows is really difficult to outline exactly how it works and what it is. So I'm really not sure. I'm just really not sure, actually.
Like, I like the point you raised there. So if a cow can give in so much as it's there for food. So then we have to think about how much is the cow worthy of moral consideration. And I think a cow is worthy of moral consideration, but I don't think it's worthy of moral consideration all the way up to the point where it should like never be killed. but I think it's worthy of moral consideration in so much as it's worth living like a good life and not being cooped up and not being like abused, and living like a good long life. And then perhaps, I don't know how healthy it is to eat older animals. I don't know if that's an argument against this, but because essentially you're raising the cow for food, and in that respect you're giving the cow life, and then you take into account the cow's value so much so that the cow's worthy of a good life, and then the moral contribution the contribution it's given to society is the food we rear from the cow after it's lived its life. I think there is a moral way to not be vegetarian and vegan, although I do think that is also a very moral thing.
Do you believe that we should perhaps give more moral consideration to farm animals such as cows than we already do?
Yes, on a moral standpoint, I think definitely. From what I know, most of the meat industry is big time cruel. And there's also a further consideration in so much as land that cows takes up and all the impacts that has on the world. So that's not really morals.
So it seems to me like what you're saying is because they contribute they contribute physically to a society, we therefore owe them something back in terms of they've contributed something very literally.
I don't think it's so much that we owe them because they're giving us meat. I just think because of their sentience and stuff, we owe them a moral consideration. I just think I think an animal is worthy of moral consideration outside of what they're giving to us.
Yeah.
Anyway, and then if it so happens, in this case, what we're giving the animal, I guess, is a chance at life and a chance at that sentience, and then in return for raising and grazing, for raising and grazing it, we get meat in return from it. But it's like the same as like wild animals are still worthy of moral consideration, not because even if they're giving any meat or giving anything into us, they're just worthy of it because of their sentience.
So we also slightly strayed from the point I was trying to get at in the sense that should a creature be considered morally when it has quite probably doesn't have the capacity to consider you in a moral framework, if that makes sense? You can treat a cow with morality, but in no sense is a cow going to look at you and think, this human being has rights, I therefore cannot do this and this. If a cow goes up and eats your food, it's not going to feel guilt. It doesn't realise that it's done anything wrong because it doesn't have the mental capacity to understand a moral framework.
I do fully believe that if an animal can form an emotional attachment with a human being, this sort of alien party, especially if they're familiarised with their own species and living in a group of their own species, if they can form this emotional attachment to a human being, I mean, there's lots of cases, usually it's a child, but it's quite common that they do form these emotional attachments. I think we should definitely consider them more morally, specifically because they've shown, or they can show in this sort of emotional attachment, they can show kindness and not directly moral consideration. I'm not really sure how it works, but they will offer food, for instance. It's very rare, but they can offer food to, let's say, a starving human being, because they know that they won't die as soon as a human being will. So it's a really complicated question. I couldn't really answer it properly without Googling some science.
Tom?
We could Google some stuff. Well, I was just thinking, do we have any examples of animals in the wild that have saved humans that are in danger? I don't know if there's an animal or a human that's hanging on the edge of a cliff and an elephant walks up and puts his trunk around him and lifts him up. Then that is showing some sort of compassion towards humans. I mean, I know dolphins do that sort of thing, but they're like a next level up, aren't they?
A lot of the time, not a lot of the time, but a lot of examples we do actually have of animals going out of their way to save other animals or human beings. It's usually a herbivore protecting from a danger or protecting from a carnivore. So it's difficult to say whether or not that's because they consider us morally, or because they're aware of the danger and it's in their instinct as a herbivore. Therefore, they probably live in a group where they all look out for each other in some sort of way. whether or not it's just based on instinct alone.
Well, I've got some examples here. These 5 stories of amazing times wild animals saved people in need will leave you awestruck.
It is also worth noticing this is on a website called onegreenplanet.org, so it's very probably a very biased outlet of information.
Definitely.
Hopefully, if the stories are true, then they're true. 3 lions save girl from kidnappers. Interesting. A 12-year-old girl was snatched by 4 men in rural southwest Ethiopia as she made her way home from school. A week after the kidnapping, her captors were attempting to move her, with police in hot pursuit when 3 lions chased the 3 men off. The lions remained with the terrified girl until police officers arrived to escort her to safety.
Well, I think that's an example. Even though they're not herbivores, like I said earlier, that's definitely an example of animals protecting a child. Which I would assume is instinct because it's natural for them to protect the young. But it's difficult to say as well because the lions would also choose to prey on, let's say, a baby gazelle rather than a fully grown one.
Don't they even do it sometimes to like other baby lions? Or some animals do it to other baby ones. Bears do it, I think.
Primates are really bad for it. They will actually eat infants that have died in a fight between 2 tribes, I guess. Just to prove how savage they are. That's really interesting.
Yeah. A couple of other ones here. Sea lion saves man who jumped off Golden Gate Bridge. Deer chases away woman's attacker. Beavers comfort and save an orphaned boy.
That's another example of a child who'd be crying or screaming in some way.
Yeah, I think the child thing is definitely a big point in this. But yeah, well, that's interesting. So maybe in some cases they can.
Do you think they should be treated equally to a human being and given the same moral consideration as a human being? Or do you agree that it would depend entirely on the species of animal as well as the individual?
I agree that it depends on the species of animal and their autonomy, I think, and what they're capable of as an intelligent being. Although I don't like using intelligence to be a factor completely in the animal's moral consideration, but yeah, just that.
So, do you think it's morally okay or morally permissible to eat meat or to kill an animal specifically to use its goods?
I really struggle with this one. I've been vegan for a while. Now I'm bad vegan, not really vegan. I think they are worthy of. I think they're worthy of so much moral consideration now, in so much that it's worth not eating meat because the meat industry is so horrific.
Yeah.
I think they're worthy of moral consideration in that regard, but I do stand by sort of what I said earlier, where if you're raising them and they're living a good life and then you're just kind of eating them when they're old or whatever, I don't think that's terrible. My views may change on this again. I need to think more on the matter.
I think a very important part of that as well, looking past the sort of higher mental capacities of animals, is at least a lot of the animals we farm anyway do definitely have a capacity for pain, which I think, regardless of how intelligent they are in other senses, is a universally negative thing. I think it's very difficult to argue that a creature that is experiencing pain can ever be a positive, morally good thing. I definitely think that the meat industry at the moment causes a great deal of suffering to animals that is somewhat unnecessary. If we had a more sustainable way of, more painless way of harvesting our meat and growing animals and these kind of things, it would have to fall back onto the kind of arguments we were talking about earlier, whether or not they do deserve deep moral consideration. But at the moment, I think just an argument from the fact that they do suffer is argument enough to think the meat industry is a negative thing.
So, a quick question. Do you think it's morally okay to eat the meat of an animal who's died of natural causes?
Yes.
Thomas?
Yep. I don't see a problem with it.
Well, do you think it's morally okay to eat the flesh of a human being who has died of natural causes?
I knew you was going to say this.
I see no moral implications about it at all.
No, I don't think so either, unless you are worried about some sort of societal problems that were
Well,
arise.
yeah. We can assume that if you would receive no punishment for it.
Or you weren't going to start a trend of pulling people out of the ground and eating them and these kind of things.
Yeah.
But as a standalone action, trying to remove any long-term implications, I don't think it could be a bad thing.
Well, they would have to have like no family as
Yeah.
well, so you're not disrespecting the family by disrespecting their dead member's body.
Well,
or anything like that.
we're ignoring all excess information. It's just
Wild man.
here's a dead human being who you have nothing to do with their death.
Yeah.
You're
They've
hungry.
Just died.
Good bit of thigh there. Do you see a moral problem with it?
Not at all. I think once a creature has died, whether it's an animal or a human being, they lack any of the criteria that gives them that sovereignty over their own body. Like,
It's literally fair game.
yeah, I mean, I'm quite convinced by Mary Ann Warren's personhood theory, in that to qualify for moral consideration, you need to have certain traits like sentience, emotionality, the ability to reason, capacity to communicate, self-awareness, and moral agency. I completely just remembered all of that off the top of my head.
Sure
Nah.
you did, mate.
At least you take notes in the lectures, man. That's good.
Yeah. But obviously, once a person's expired and they no longer have any brain function at all, none of that applies anymore.
They aren't counted as human beings,
Yeah.
you're saying. They're just a piece of meat.
It's just an entity that you can gain nutrients from.
I would question the psyche of a person that would eat another human's meat. I think it's only acceptable in the situation of if you are really desperately hungry and it's your last solution. I think if there's just you come across a wild human and you think, oh, that thigh looks tasty, I really think that's a bad thing, and I would question your psyche at that point.
Well, I think that's probably more of a societal thing, that our society, we're conditioned to be revolted by that kind of thing. We know that there are tribes in, is it Brazil, like where they still have very untouched tribes?
Everywhere, man.
Yeah,
Everywhere.
but all throughout history there have been tribes that practice cannibalism as part of their culture, and whether it be respecting their dead or disrespecting their fallen enemies by eating them. It's I think one of the reasons we're so revolted by it is just because our society has told us and conditioned us that it's a very negative thing.
I just want to point out I'm not revolted by it at all.
Such a dick. I don't know. I struggle to believe it is a completely societal thing. I actually think it's a psychological thing, where to eat another human, I do think there's some sort of psychological trait probably wrong with you if you find at any point a slice of human meat appealing, unless it's so far as it's for pure survival. And in these cases of tribesmen and that, I feel like it's more ritualistic behaviour that, and I would probably question their psyche as well and their like level of intelligence to make decisions like that. And I think in a lot of cases like that, they also, when they eat the shamans, they get quite sick.
So, you'd question the person's psyche, you'd question their psychological state. How about if it was packaged in a supermarket similar to some chicken or some beef? Do you think that, I mean, we can probably all agree that this sort of ignorance of the death and the corpse and removing the meat and everything, would you still question their psychology?
Yes, I would then question it to the point of society, and I would think society's fucked up.
But you agree that it isn't immoral?
I'm not sure what I think about that yet. I'd have to think of it.
All right, fair enough.
I need to make my mind up on that one.
So
But I'm probably not going to go home and think about the moral implications of eating humans.
So going on the chat we had about the rights and the values of animals and human beings, that I think can lead us very swiftly onto abortion. So what would you rate, I guess, a fetus, if we go by one definition where it's all about sentience and these qualities, or would you talk more about the species that it's fundamentally a species, it's a human being? What consideration would you apply to that then?
So a fetus. So we're saying, what value does a fetus have?
Yeah.
Well, I really like the paper, and I can't remember who it was by. I think it was by that Marcus guy. Do you have any notes on it?
That's accurate.
Yeah. So his argument was that a fetus. Well, his argument is why death is bad, and in short, he says death is bad because it deprives us of the potential of life that we could have lived, and this is based on the assumption that the life we could have lived would have been lived in a way that we wanted to live it and had value. And then he says, on that regard, if that's why death is bad, then the abortion of a fetus is bad because it's depriving them of the potential life that could have been lived in a way they wanted to live it.
So in short, it's not only a cruelty but an injustice because they're missing out on the experience that they should get.
I guess by following that logic purely as well, you would say that killing a fetus is worse because they have more potential life than, say, an old person.
Theoretically, obviously.
Yeah.
They could die at a month's old of natural cause.
But I think it gives a good standpoint for us to go off. And then we have to come into, so how much value is a human life? So do we think a human life has more value than an animal's life? And then I think we do because of like the autonomy we have and all the experience we have and the things we do, and we build rockets and stuff, and that's really cool. Very philosophical.
Yeah.
Yeah. I lost my point when I spoke about rockets.
Nice job.
I mean, I don't know if I'm particularly convinced by the potential life like ours strategy. If you cut off a fetus's life before it develops into a human, there has at no point existed a human being whose life you've cut short.
So you believe it's all about the qualities rather than the species?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I heard it put like this, where it would only be bad to kill a fetus if you didn't kill it and it became a human, because then you would be depriving it of that human's life. If you kill a fetus before it becomes a human, at no point has there been a human-like life that you've cut short. I mean, it's quite difficult if you're going to take your standpoint that a fetus's life should be preserved because one day it may have a life like ours. The implications of that then go on to smaller things like sperms and eggs and all the various other pre-building blocks that make up a fetus that we would never in our right minds argue that have a right to live.
Did you want to say something, mate? You had your hand up.
Yeah. I have to put my hand up because apparently I interrupt too much. Sorry, mate. Fucking hate you, man. I can't remember the first point. You've distracted me.
Sorry.
But my second point, you said that the implications there of a fetus's potential life, and if this is a valid argument, the implications leads to more and more questions such as what's the value of potential life on a sperm cell or an egg cell or blah blah blah. I mean, we've had this discussion before, like many times.
And we've never made any headway on it, so this should be interesting for you.
But I like the idea of a cake mix. So we have a cake mix, and the sugar by itself is just sugar. The flour by itself is just flour, and the egg, and all these other ingredients. By themselves are just ingredients.
Yeah.
But once you put them together and put them in the oven obviously being the womb, once you put the cake mix together and put it in the oven, then it's going to become a cake. All you need to do is give it heat and take it out when it's ready. So I don't see an issue with the potential of life, because this cake mix is potentially going to be a pretty nice cake as long as you just keep it warm.
Yeah. But in the same sense, you can just say that the sugar is going to be a potentially nice cake as long as you add some eggs and flour. It seems an arbitrary cutoff to me to say that at this point it gets its value, but ever so slightly before it has no value of life at all. It seems like an arbitrary cutoff to me.
I strongly disagree.
Okay. Justify. That's something we're trying to do more in this podcast. Justify.
I disagree with that, specifically because that's sugar or sperm can be used for lots of different things. Leaving the analogies alone, sperm by itself, it does die, or I think there's a scientific neutralizer or something, like a cell doesn't actually die, it's whatever. So sperm dies by itself, and it dissolves and more sperm is made, and it's a long cycle in the testes. You can have an involuntary discharge, so you could ejaculate while sleeping or whatever.
Yeah.
You can have a voluntary discharge, where obviously you might masturbate or apply some sort of stimuli.
Okay. So without getting too far down into that rabbit hole of explaining the different ways you can ejaculate,
well, my point was that sperm by itself is easily thrown away, which I would argue implies it shouldn't have a value until it's actually part of the compound, until it's part of the cake mix.
See, for me, just in short, a fetus is the very early stage of a human and it's, I guess what you're getting at is that it's inevitably going to become a human unless there is action taken to rid it of that.
Yep.
So, there's literally nothing that needs to be done as long as the mother sustains herself, which you'd argue she's going to do anyway. It's going to become a human. But there is a good argument on the side of the mother that I think we can introduce now. What's it called?
it's the violinist.
The violinist argument, yeah. So how's that go? So I'm going to describe it in a slightly different way. In the way of the violinist, you've been taken of your own free will and hooked up to a famous violinist, and you have to sustain them for a couple of months? 9 months.
9 months.
You have to sustain them for 9 months. You've been kept against your will. What if they got a broken liver or something, and they have to use your liver?
Yeah.
A broken liver?
Yeah, the liver's busted.
Oh, your liver's busted.
Yeah.
Get you a new one in.
And they have to be hooked up to a machine with you for 9 months, so essentially they use your liver as well. And then the question is, do you have the right to unplug yourself from the machine, therefore causing the death of the person attached to you?
Right. So,
Is that pretty much it?
yeah, that sounds like pretty much it.
Yeah, that's summarised.
I've heard two arguments. Two arguments I quite like. One argument is you should get rid of the violinist or the fetus because it was involuntary. So this would justify termination of pregnancy when the pregnancy is a result of rape. But I'm not convinced by that argument at all.
Really?
Yeah, really.
Bastard, aren't you?
Is yeah, as harsh as it sounds. Specifically because in the case of the violinist, which is an easier way to explain it without hurting feelings, which, as we know, the lefts value a lot these days.
Cheap dig.
That was pretty cheap.
Slide that one in there.
I don't know where I'll edit it out.
Okay. Back into the point.
Yeah. So the violinist is still existing. Is still going to exist after the pregnancy, and I think getting rid of the violinist because it was involuntary should have no sway on your decision whatsoever. That should have no sway just because it was involuntary.
Yeah.
I think at that point it's merely spite. It's I didn't choose this, so I'm not going to have it.
Yeah.
At that point it's spite. It's an easy way to get out of actually making the decision by just saying it was involuntary, and I think that's a cruelty by itself.
See, now, I actually agree with you in a sense,
Wait.
in that whether or not it was voluntary is somewhat arbitrary. The point of this argument is not to try and disprove that a fetus is worthy of moral consideration like we were doing before. It's that it's actually an argument about your own sovereignty over your own body.
Yeah, your sacrifice.
In that there is arguably there's no situation in which somebody else can infringe on your body without your desire to do so. And because of that, I agree with you in the sense that whether or not you agree to have the violinist attached or agree to have the fetus inside of you, or if it's done involuntarily, I think as soon as you decide that you no longer want this entity attached to your body, you are fully within your rights to have it removed, because at the end of the day, it is your body and you should have full control over what happens to it.
Yeah, I do agree to that in a sense. Obviously, maybe not obviously. Actually, I wasn't using the involuntary violinist as an example. I was using it as a way to disprove what people would use as an example against, for getting rid of the violinist. Some people do use that as part of their reasoning.
Okay, and why does that disprove?
Well, because at that point, I can only imagine it to be spite, which is, as far as I'm concerned, malicious.
I mean, I don't know why you've jumped to that conclusion. I mean,
I'm just saying it shouldn't have a sway on your decision.
Yeah.
Because it was involuntary, because that isn't very fair at all. That isn't very fair on the product from this involuntary act.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think that regardless of your motivations, you could be doing it for a practical reason, an emotional reason, like, fuck this violinist guy. The bottom line of this argument is anyway that this entity is infringing on your body, and you are fully within your rights to decide whether they continue to do so or not, for whatever justification you want. I think for this argument, it would be reasonable to just say that 3 months down the line, you and the violinist had an argument, and you think, wow, they're a bit of a cunt, I might as well take them off my body now, and I still think you'd be justified to do that because it's your body. I think Tom might have something to say about that in terms of the weakening of your position. We had a discussion before about whether or not the length of time that you're into the process affects whether or not you're still in a justified position to pull out, so to speak. Do you have any thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, I agree with, what's the argument called again?
The violinist.
The violinist.
It's Thomas's.
I think the violinist argument is a good argument, and I think it gives you both gave good points, but I think it does give a good, strong point that you, as a mother, like her right to her own sovereignty and the right to her own body, she's allowed to unplug the violinist. However, I do think that, for example, the longer she leaves it, it weakens your position to then unplug. I think it can be argued that, so you could argue that, I don't know, you have the violinist plugged for 8 months, and then you say, this 8 months has been a pain, I can't be asked to go through another month of this, I'm going to unplug. I think that weakens your position, as far as you should think, right, I've got to go through 9 months of this, and then you unplug. I think it applies to like the case of a fetus as well. I mean, we can throw away for now how developed the fetus is and whether that gives it more value during the pregnancy. I just think that I'm losing my track of thought. I think that because of how long you've kind of already signed like a contract, not a contract, but some sort of
obligation.
Yeah, some sort of heir obligation to this thing to look after it for longer. And when you've already done it for 8 months, it feels like if I was the violinist and I was connected to this person for 8 months and they'd been taking care of me for 8 months, then they said, you know what, I don't really fancy it for this final month, I'd feel pretty hard done by. And although that's not an actual moral argument as such,
so
I think it weakens your position and then starts to strengthen the position of other arguments that can come against it.
So you feel that time has an effect on how much of a injustice your acts are by terminating whatever scenario we're going by?
Yeah, in this regard, I think it's because, like in the case of a pregnancy, if you go through like 30 to 38 weeks pregnancy, it feels like there also must be some sort of reason for it. You're not just hanging on to the pregnancy, and then this fetus is then becoming further and further developed and more autonomous, and it is gaining more and more value, arguably, depending on where you come from, and then all of a sudden you're cutting it short. I really don't like that, and I think it then introduces other arguments. For example, when a fetus becomes valuable, and then you weaken your position due to other arguments and being able to come in and say, hold on a minute, this is a 30-week developed fetus. It's it can hear you, it can react to stuff you're saying, it's got autonomy now. You're losing where your position's coming from.
I think that's actually one of the strengths of the violinist argument, is because in making the person attached to you a fully developed man, a violinist who's already contributing to society, if you concede that it's a strong argument, you're then forced to concede, which is, I think, a direction you're starting to move in, Tom, that the stage of development of the fetus doesn't matter, because even if it is fully developed all the way up to a man, it's still morally permissible to remove him from your body. So if the fetus is a week old or 8.5 months old, you're still justified to do it because through the reasoning within the argument, you're justified to do it to a fully developed man contributing to society.
Yeah, see, I kind of think you're right, and I still kind of think you're wrong. But
Why?
I do need to think on it a little bit more. It just, I don't know. Can I say I don't know?
You can. It's probably better than making some shit up like Will normally does. So.
This isn't a formal debate.
just-
No, it's true.
It feels like, especially in the case of the violinist, where it's another sentient human being, which I guess if you consider the fetus a completely sentient human being, it would seem immoral to me to go through 8 months and then decide to unplug. And I guess, but I know I'm alone on this viewpoint, and I'll draw a comparison. And we had a comparison come up in class where someone was dying next to you in a room, and they can be revived, or not revived, they can be saved by putting your cool hand on their head.
Took you a while to think of that word, didn't it, mate?
It did, yeah. I'm struggling today. And so I argued that you are morally obliged, if you're in the same room, to put your hand on their head to save their life, because it really isn't much effort.
It's just too convenient.
Right. However, if you had to fly from one end of the world to where you are, and there was a lot more involved, then I would argue, okay, you no longer have to do it. So I guess you can bring that argument across to where you're now, I don't know, a month away or 2 weeks away from being able to save this person's life. From that point then, so if we example short of the time from 9 months to a week or 2 weeks, this person needs to be plugged into you for 2 weeks to live. I then think that you're more morally obliged to do it. I think in the case of the violinist, it's a bit more of a shout to say that you need to be plugged in for 2 weeks and have your liver used, but in the case of the cool hand, I definitely think you're morally obliged if you're in the same room. So I think I can draw a strength from that and say that it's because of the shortening of the time and the amount of effort required to then save a life. That's why I think you should do it.
I really like that argument.
Got there in the end, didn't I?
It's a good one, mate. It's a good one.
I can't remember the word. Is it? I said it earlier. Supererogatory.
Yeah.
I think there would be grounds to say that an act like that, where it's not a huge penance on you to go on to save this person's life, I would probably consider that as a supererogatory. Is that the word?
What does that mean?
I'm going to feel like a dick if I've said it wrong.
It is.
It's basically an act that is good and it's laudable. That's one of Will's favourite words.
I like that one.
And commendable act, but it isn't obliged morally. You're not morally obliged to do it. I think that in that kind of situation, you would be putting your own rights on the back burner for the benefit of somebody else. And I think that is supererogatory, but I don't think it's morally obliged, because I don't think in any sense our morality should be able to oblige us to do certain acts. I think you shouldn't have to put your own human rights over your body and just your innate human rights. I don't think there should be a situation in which you're obliged to give those up. That's the reason it's a right. But if you wanted to do that, it would be a supererogatory thing. But I don't think it would necessarily make you a bad person or an immoral person to not go through with that and preserve the rights you've got and unplug the violinist.
Yeah, I've quite a mixed opinion of that. Because on one half, I do agree with you there. I think, yeah, these are my rights. I have these for a reason. I shouldn't have to sacrifice them. But I do think that the different rights have different values. And for instance, I think that your right of freedom is trumped by someone else's right of life.
Okay.
Right to live. So, for instance, if you needed to put your hand on someone's head to save their life, I feel you are morally obliged to do that, specifically because of the social contract we have, specifically because of the society that we live in.
Yeah.
We do have a moral obligation to help people if it's convenient. But I also believe that if it's severely inconvenient, we still have the obligation. However, people don't have the right to tell you to do it. So you can choose not to do it,
Yeah.
and you might get some verbal abuse or whatever, but you shouldn't be, for instance, punished by the government or some sort of societal rule.
See, I agree with that. I just agree that it also applies to moral rules. I think you should have the option to do so, but you shouldn't be forced by the rules of morality.
Well, I think it would be morally bad not to do it. I think you do have an obligation, as long as the overall result is a benefit.
Okay.
I cut my arm off to save your life. I still think that's very, very reasonable, because it's your life over just one arm.
See, that to me sounds like a very slippery slope, in that if your morality is going to start, if you're going to take a utilitarian viewpoint on it and start saying that the morality is able to infringe on my rights if it results in an overall net gain of positivity.
I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I'm not saying morality has a right to infringe on your rights. I'm saying you have an obligation, but you should not be punished for not following it. They don't have the right to ask.
Well, there's punishment in itself, that in saying if you don't follow your moral obligations, you are immoral. And that is to imply that you're doing the wrong thing.
You are doing the wrong thing by not helping.
I don't agree with that.
Well,
for reasons I've stated.
I kind of agree with you, Will. I would further your point in so much as whether I see it as a morally bad act or not. So I think we should strive to be morally good. And then I get where you're coming from as well when it comes down to the question of, do we have to do these morally good things, which I agree we don't, but I do think...
Sorry there, minor recording technical difficulty. Tom, can you pick up where you left?
Right, yep. I was getting somewhere at it being a morally good act and avoiding a morally bad act. I was kind of furthering your point, I think, Will.
Good.
So in my opinion, I guess I'd like to draw more on the cool hand on the head.
Yeah, Henry Fonda's cool hand.
Henry Fonda?
Yeah.
Nicely
I'm quite fond
done.
of that argument.
I like that, yeah. So I would say that by not putting your hand on the head, you are being morally bad. And I think we strive to avoid moral badness. And then I would further this on the case of, in the case of the violinist, I'm not sure if you're morally bad by not furthering the life, especially in a short time span. Obviously, I'm concentrating on a short time span now. But I would maybe say it's morally neutral, and I think we should strive for moral goodness. So in that case of where it's saving a life for like a couple of weeks of autonomy, I think we should strive to be morally good. But I do get where you're coming from, Matthew, in that you don't have to do it. However, in the case of that cool hand on the head, I think you really do have to do it. But I was also the only person that put my hand up in class for that and said that, so I feel like I'm severely outnumbered.
I also put my hand up for that as well.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe
I think there's only 3 of us or 4 of us that did it.
Don't appeal to the masses, man. If you have the truth and everybody else is wrong,
Yeah,
the fact
exactly.
that everybody else is wrong doesn't make your truth any less true. So it seems like we've all been talking about morality quite a lot, and I'm just wondering if we could talk a little bit about what exactly we feel morality is and how far-reaching it should be in a moral person's life.
And what our obligations are.
Yeah. So does anyone want to kick off with their idea of morality? Because I don't think we're operating on one fixed idea of what morality is. I mean, I'm very liberal in the sense that I subscribe a lot to Mill's concept, in that the way we should, the moral man shouldn't really be infringing upon other people's lives in any way, unless to protect the freedoms of others. And I think what it really boils down to is behaving in a way that doesn't infringe on the lives and wills of other people. How about you, Will?
Yeah, so I probably have 5 points, or 5 moral rules that I think are important. Now, the first one, I fully believe the most important moral, I guess it's not really a moral rule, but the most important thing I think morally is life. I think death is the worst thing out there. I think death is, I know for a fact Thomas disagrees with me because we've had this discussion a couple of times, but I think death is the greatest evil. And then I think it goes to cruelty, but I think cruelty is also partnered with freedom and your right to freedom. So it goes life, and then it goes cruelty and freedom, because I feel that freedom is important, because obviously you have the ability to choose what to do, whether or not free will is possible, you should have the freedom to make your decisions.
Yeah.
And I think cruelty does one of two things. Cruelty either restricts your freedom or it produces pain. And obviously, pain is a negative thing, and pain is one of the reasons why freedom is so important. So we can have the ability, the opportunity to live a good life without pain and with the least amount of happiness we could possibly have. So it goes life, then freedom and cruelty. And then, I'll be honest, I forgot the other three.
Okay, so that was Will's 5 points of morality. I don't know if it was 3 points. I don't know if it was 12.
It was free, wasn't it?
It was
No.
two. It was two.
You had pain as well. Did you fit that
Freedom
into
and cruelty. Freedom and cruelty are the second one.
So you've presented that. I'll just cross out.
Terribly.
I'll cross out the number 5 and write a 3. It's fine. So do you think that's in a hierarchy, in a sense, that the preservation of life should come first, and then, or do you think are they all on an equal?
I do fully believe, I am a fan of moral absolutes.
Okay.
So, in order for there to be morality, it has to be right in every situation possible. And me and Thomas have had arguments on whether or not life or death would be right in what circumstance. And I am too stubborn to give way on that. And I always stand by the idea that I think life should never be exterminated, and there is no reason you would restrict someone's right to life, even if it meant self-preservation. I don't believe morally that is a good reason. I think that would be the greater of two evils in every scenario possible.
So you're saying that the utmost and most important element of morality is the preservation of human life, or life in general? I
do believe so, yes. But I do understand Thomas's argument, who's got his hand up, because he does also agree with freedom and cruelty, and this leads on to stuff like euthanasia and tricky subjects like that, which can, he believes, contradict life and death. What do you think, Tom?
I guess it's the cruelty one. The example I gave to you was if you are a person being tortured in a room with zero chance of ever escaping the torture, although one chance arises where you can take your own life, can you take your own life? And I think you can, to escape the cruelty. So I guess in your regards, I would say that cruelty is worse. I guess cruelty would be the worst, and then death would be an escape from cruelty. But I mean, it's only in real strict circumstances, because I'm not sure how much I favour... I was going to say how much I favour suicide. But I mean, you know, how much I favour people committing suicide, I guess, and whether I think it's like a morally right act. But in that situation, I think it's definitely the best thing you should do, and I don't think you should continue your life. And that's where our disagreement lies, because you think that you should continue your life under all circumstances.
Yeah. So you believe that life is a right and life is important morality, but you don't think it's the most important. You think cruelty and freedom are first, and then life is lower than that.
Or you might just have a complete separate system to the patented Will 3-tier morality system.
Five tier.
Five. There's two hidden premises there that you're able to find on your own. But have you thought about it, Tom? Like, have you got a particular way you perceive morality and how it should influence us?
I guess I'm slightly utilitarian in this, which is a bad thing. I don't like. I think I think morals can extend to what you owe to other people, and I think morals can extend to help progress humans. In so much as that's the reason why I think you are morally obliged to put your hand on the forehead and save their life, because it's progressive and it helps humans. So I think it can, in regards to like saving lives when it's not at too much of a great cost to you, I think there is moral obligation there, and I think that could be extended to other areas that like furthers the human race and helps us grow as people and you know, progress. That's what I'm all about.
I'm wondering if you have a particular point at which it then becomes... This is just Will had his hand up. This is just a short point. I'm just wondering if you have a point at which it switches from not being obligated to being obligated. Like if Henry Fonda is in the room and he can do it, you think that is a moral necessity for him to do it. But what if he's in the next room? What if he's 5 rooms down? What if he's in the next house? It just seems like, unless you define it, it's just going to be an arbitrary point at which you're saying, hey, you now have to do this, as opposed to now you don't.
Yeah, there's definitely difficulty to draw a line there as to say where it takes too much effort and then where the effort is like within your limits. And I mean, it's hard to draw that line, and I could probably think of this more and get back to you on that. But for now, I think it's just down to how much you feel it would really move you out of your way. So if Henry Ford lives on the same street as you, Henry Ford, don't like him doing. If Henry Fonda lives on the same street as you, and I say I'm Henry Fonda, and someone phones me up and says, such and such is dying upstairs, I need you to come and put your magic hand on their head, of course I will come and do that, But, yeah, I need to work on the line for that. I think you're right, but I think a line could be drawn. I think it's possible to figure out at which point it becomes too much effort and then there's no need to do it. But I mean, and then it goes on to whether it becomes a morally good thing to do it, or what's the word, supererogatory, and then you'd further go into supererogatory. But I think the more supererogatory people become, the more we will progress as a race. So the more we strive to do moral goods, and the more that we make morally good things morally obliged, the further we will progress as like a civilization.
So, I think you're entirely wrong there, mate.
Why?
I'm not sure if this is the right word. Obviously, in education, there's lots of really big, fancy words. But I think you're coming at it from a consequentialist viewpoint there. Like, the morality is based on the consequences of it. Now, a problem with that, as you've already pointed out, is where does that stop? Like, I firmly believe there's direct or known consequences of the action is what's important. But you're sort of saying, like, obviously getting an airplane across the world to save this person's life, I would agree is morally good. But I can only imagine that you think it's morally bad because you've got, the price, you've got the inconvenience of the time, pollution, and maybe you're a doctor or something, so you're inconveniencing some patients you have in the old country you were in. And so I think this, again, I'm not sure if it's the right word, but this consequentialist viewpoint, I think it causes a lot more questions than solutions, especially when it comes to morality.
It almost seems like you're putting a figure on the value of the person's life, and if the cost of you saving that person's life weighs up as as more, then you don't need to save them, or if it's lower, then you are obliged to save them. But I think that's quite a dangerous and fraught with implications way to look at it.
That's what Hitler did, mate.
Oh, we'll drop that bombshell. You know what I mean, though? It almost seems like it should either be necessary in every single situation or not necessary in any situation, because otherwise you are assigning a very specific, or you would need to put a very specific value on this individual's life in order to be able to make that calculation of whether or not you're obliged to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a difficult thing to do. It's a theory I need to work on more. But, like, in the example of if Will fell over now and crumbled and I had the magic healing
you would
hand,
laugh. Yeah. Don't lie.
I think in every situation there, I am morally obliged to do it. So I think this can carry over to to where it can apply to every single situation.
So one situation could be if I chose to fall, if I chose to crumble, I chose to die, would you still intervene and save my life?
So in other words, if you were to commit suicide.
Yeah, because you just said it was your moral obligation in every situation.
If you started slitting your wrists here right now, then yes, I would stop you from slitting your wrists.
Mate, I'm not pussy, I cleave.
Cleave.
You started cleaving your wrists. Then yes, and I think everyone in that situation should.
Just a quick disclaimer, that was a joke. We don't mean to cause any offence.
Oh, they know, Will. Don't interrupt him for that.
You'd be surprised, mate.
Please, Tom.
If, however, you delivered me a big, long essay on why you are, of sound, this is going off morals a bit, but of why you are of a sound mind to commit this act of slitting your wrists, and I read it and I assessed that you're in a good sound mind, then maybe I'd let you commit the act, because I'm not sure, you know, in like euthanasia and suicide terms, if you can ever be in a sound mind, but it's possible. But in the other case, yes, I'm morally obliged there to stop you doing it, and the same as I'm morally obliged to look after you if you were to keel over and start having a seizure or something like that. I think I'm morally obliged, because I think we should avoid moral bads, and it'd be morally bad for me to ignore you and walk out the room.
So you admit there's an issue with consequentialism, but you still believe that we should aim for the biggest greatness, the biggest good.
Yeah, in some situations. I think it's more avoiding, in this case, you know, it's more avoiding being morally bad. But yeah, I think we should be aiming on whole to be morally good, and it would be good to have a moral framework around that. I think it's more progressive. Whether it's morally sound or not is quite questionable.
Okay, well, I think we're coming up to the 1 hour mark. I'm sure there's a lot more we could say on this topic, but if we feel inclined to, we can pick it up next time. I've been Matthew.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Howard.
It's not Howard, his name's Will. And that has been the... What is the name? Have we even got a name for this podcast?
So what we're doing is, in the description in the podcast, we describe it as the Philosophy Podcast, but the actual name is still up for discussion.
Okay, well, this is placeholder name here. Thank you for coming in and listening. We appreciate it very much. Thank you and goodbye.
I really like free students exploring ideas or something.
I really like if people watching this would subscribe, like, and leave a comment.
Bye!